The Queen Mary, one of the most legendary ocean liners to ever be built, and one of the last Golden Age ocean liners to still exist today. Winner of the Blue Ribbon, this vessel served her country proudly throughout the first few years of her life. Then, after World War II broke out, the Queen Mary was responsible for transporting around 810,000 troops during the war. Winston Churchill later said that the Queen Mary made such a difference during the war that she shortened the war by over a year. Hitler even tried to put a bounty on the Queen Mary to encourage U-boat captains to sink her. However, despite this, the Queen Mary persevered and made it through the war, surviving a few incidents that could have spelled disaster for other ships. Once the Queen Mary returned to her passenger services, she would continue to serve her country proudly for several more decades, officially earning her the title of one of the most legendary ocean liners to ever exist. However, despite this, the full story of the Queen Mary is largely forgotten by most people today. Well, I want to change that. The purpose of the series that you are about to watch is to tell the full legendary story of the Queen Mary, from her birth to her eventual retirement. So join me today as we tell the full story of the Queen Mary, one of the most legendary ocean liners to ever sail the seas. I hope you enjoy.
The story of the Queen Mary began in the late 1920s. During this time, the world was experiencing a massive economic boom. Businesses were thriving, people had more money to spend, and as a result of this, they were looking to travel more. Now, steamship companies like the Cunard Line and the White Star Line were hoping to entice people to travel on board their prospective vessels. However, they had a problem they had to deal with first. You see, a lot of the ships owned by these companies were starting to get pretty old by this point. Some good examples of this would be the Cunard Line's RMS Mauritania or the White Star Line's RMS Olympic. Now, to be fair, it was in the 1920s that the Olympic went through its first kinda big popularity phase. You see, what I mean by this is, the Olympic was starting to feel pretty antiquated by the late 1920s. However, she still remained pretty busy because this was the time period where the Titanic went through its first popular phase, and people saw traveling on the Olympic as a way to experience what it was like to sail aboard the Titanic. However, they were still only doing this for more of a novelty experience, I guess you could say. It wasn't like the Olympic was crazy popular because it was up to date with all the latest trends. It was just seen as a novelty. So, the Cunard Line and the White Star Line were hoping to build some new ships that would further entice the public to travel on board their prospective vessels. This agenda was further motivated by the fact that Germany had two brand new ships that were getting ready to come out that would further revolutionize the shipping industry. These two ships were known as the Bremen and the Europa, and these British steamship companies did not want to fall behind Germany. So they quickly began planning out the idea for two brand new revolutionary ships, one owned by the White Star Line and one owned by the Cunard Line, that would be used to compete with these two new ships coming from Germany. Now, at first, it appeared that the White Star Line was moving a little bit faster than the Cunard Line was in regards to getting construction work started on their new ship. You see, while the Cunard Line was still busy planning out their new ship, the White Star Line went ahead and ordered theirs so construction work could begin. However, this isn't to say that the White Star Line had already completely finished planning out their new ship. Quite the contrary, the plans for this ship weren't done yet. My honest opinion as to why I think they went ahead and ordered their ship, even though the plans weren't done yet, was to try to get a little bit ahead of the Cunard Line. You see, there was still one big element of their new ship that they had not figured out yet, but I'm going to talk more about that here in a minute. The White Star Line's new ship was going to be named the Oceanic, named after the very first ship bought by the White Star Line and built by Harland and Wolff back in the 1870s. This ship was also called the Oceanic. The Oceanic was going to be mammoth in its size and scale. They estimated that the ship would weigh in, once done, at somewhere around 80,000 gross registered tons. The White Star Line was aiming for, with their new ship, to do what they hadn't done since the Titanic, have the world's biggest and most luxurious ship. And honestly, if everything went according to plan in building the Oceanic, they honestly had a real shot of achieving this goal. However, despite this early lead by the White Star Line, it didn't take very long before things started to go wrong with building the Oceanic. You see, one of the biggest holdups with building the ship was the fact that several people that were involved in designing the ship, well, they couldn't agree on what type of engine the Oceanic should use. One man, whose name was Lord Kilsant, said that the Oceanic should use this new diesel-electric engine. He argued that with this new engine, the ship would be able to reach speeds, despite her size, of up to 30 knots, possibly greater, an achievement that wouldn't be beaten until the French liner Normandy entered service in the year 1935. However, there were those at Holland and Wolff that disagreed with him, and they argued that the ship should still use the traditional steam engine that they were all familiar with. This debate went on for so long that more than a year after construction on the Oceanic had begun, the ship's keel hadn't even been fully laid yet. So that should tell you how slow things were going on the Oceanic. Now, eventually, the Great Depression would happen. And when this occurred, it basically signaled the end of the Oceanic. The White Star Line and Holland and Wolff began to have massive financial difficulties. Eventually, Holland and Wolff and White Star would ultimately decide to cancel the Oceanic, and they would use the parts that they had prepared for that ship on other ships that were under construction at the time. Now, while all this was going on with the Oceanic and the White Star Line, those at the Cunard Line were still hard at work figuring out the plans for their new ship. Their new ship was officially ordered on April 3rd, 1929, and she was going to be built in the River Clyde by the John Brown and Company located in Clydebank, Scotland. Now, even though this new ship was ordered in April of 29, it wouldn't be until December of 1930 when construction work on this new ship would begin. At the time that construction started, the ship was simply known as Hull 534. They did not have the ship's official name yet, but more about that later. Now, in between the time that the ship was ordered to when construction began, the crash of 29 occurred. And at first, the Cunard Line was determined to keep construction work going on this new ship, despite this massive economic crisis that had suddenly struck the world. However, eventually, due to financial difficulties caused by the Great Depression, the Cunard Line would have no choice but to halt construction on their new ship around a year or so after construction began. Now, after some time had passed, the Cunard Line was still having a difficult time in getting the funding that they needed to resume work on Hull 534. Eventually, they decided to turn to the British government to ask them if they could have a loan, and then once they got that money, they would then use the loan to finish the ship. A representative from the Cunard Line went to the British government, and they did agree to give the Cunard Line the loan under one big condition. The Cunard Line and the White Star Line would have to merge together into one company, and then after that, they would supply the money, or give them a loan, I should say, to finish Hull 534. Now, the White Star Line was still suffering major financial difficulties during this time, and eventually they did agree to merge with the Cunard Line. But now, once this was decided, there was another big question that needed to be answered. Which company, after the merger, would be the dominant company? Would it be the Cunard Line or the White Star Line? Now, ultimately, the way they decided to figure this out would be whichever company had more ships in active service at the time of the merger would be the dominant company. Now, unfortunately for the White Star Line, they had just decommissioned a good number of ships, and if they hadn't have done that, they would have been the dominant company after the merger. However, unfortunately, because they did do this decommissioning, the Cunard Line had more active ships than the White Star Line did. So the Cunard Line would become the dominant company after the merger. Once the merging was complete, and this happened on May 10th, 1934, the two companies formed a new name. From now on, instead of being known as Cunard and White Star Line, two separate company names, the one company name would simply be Cunard White Star. Once the merger was complete and they got the funding they needed from the British government to resume work on Hull 534, Cunard White Star wasted no time and construction resumed on this ship as quickly as possible. They were really in a hurry to get Hull 534 up and running as fast as they could. That way they could get this legendary ocean liner out on the seas at last. Once work resumed on Hull 534, it began to proceed at a rapid rate. It was actually going so fast that it wouldn't be very long before the hull of the ship was completed and the vessel would be ready to be launched and enter the water for the very first time. However, before this could happen, there was an important decision that those at the Cunard Line still had to make about the ship. What on earth are we going to name her? I mean, when you have a ship as beautiful as this, she's got to have an incredible name behind her to back her up, Right? Right? That's what those at the Cunard Line thought, and honestly, I agree with them. Eventually, it was decided that they were going to name the ship after King George V, who was the King of England at the time. They were going to name the ship after his wife, Mary of Trek. So the official name of this vessel was going to be Queen Mary. Fun fact about Mary of Trek, she was actually the grandmother of the future Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II. However, at this time, Queen Elizabeth II was still a very young child. Now, for those of you out there who are familiar with the story of the Queen Mary, you probably know that there is a very funny legend out there that claims that it tells the story of how the name Queen Mary was eventually decided for this ship. And I have to tell you guys, this legend is one of the funniest stories out of all of maritime history, in my opinion. And honestly, like, when I first heard of the legend, I wasn't sure if it was true or not. But honestly, part of me always suspected that it was true. Now, the Cunard Line officially always denied that this legend actually happened. So officially, even to this day, they say that it's just a myth, it's just a legend, it didn't really happen. However, for the sake of this video, I decided to research the legend a bit and try to figure out if there are any facts to back up the legend, because as I'm sure many of you know, most legends do have elements of truth to them. And guys, you are going to be stunned at what I found. So here's what we're going to do first. I'm going to tell you the entire story with the legend first, or the entire legend story. And then after that, I'm going to tell you guys what evidence I found to try to piece together if the story in the legend actually happened. Now, the legend goes that originally, when the Cunard Line first decided that they wanted to name this ship after a member of the royal family, they first decided that they wanted to name this ship after one of Britain's most famous queens. And at the time, they were thinking Queen Victoria. And if they named the ship after Queen Victoria, it would allow the Cunard Line to keep their tradition of having the letters I and A at the end of their ship names. FYI, just because I say Cunard Line, always remember that I am actually referring to Cunard White Star. It's just easier to keep referring to them as Cunard Line, so yeah, we'll just go with that. So anyway, before they could officially name this ship after a member of the royal family, they first had to go and talk to the King of England and ask him if it was okay for them to do this. So apparently, one of the Cunard Line representatives went to the King George V, and asked him, "Are you okay if we name this ship after one of Britain's most famous queens?" And he used that exact wording, okay? And I kid you not, the king supposedly said, I really like that idea. My wife would be delighted. And as soon as he said that, the Cunard Line representative was like, of course, Your Majesty. That's totally what I meant. Sorry, guys, I had to do a take. It's hard for me to get through that story without laughing because I can totally picture that happening. 100% I can picture that happening. So anyway, after the king got confused about that, I mean, honestly, what could the Cunard Line representative say? I mean, he basically had to go along with it at that point, because if he said, no, Your Majesty, we were actually talking about Queen Victoria, as you can probably imagine, the king would get really mad about that, and I mean, who knows what would happen after that. Maybe they would take away the loan or the funding for the ship, but who knows. Anyway, after that happens, the Cunard Line basically had no choice. They had to name the ship Queen Mary. Now, as I stated earlier, officially, the Cunard Line denies 100% that this story ever happened. But it is just crazy enough that I think it probably did. And you know what? Let's investigate a little bit about that and see if this story actually did occur. Okay, so the first reference that I could find to this legend comes from a book called The Lives of Liners, published in the year 1947. The book's author, a man by the name of Frank Bernard, talks about the legend in the book. Now, his story is given a little bit more credibility because there was an editor for the Washington Post, and his name was Felix Morlaix. and he sailed as a guest on the Queen Mary during its maiden voyage in 1936. In his 1979 autobiography, Felix says that he was placed at a table with the then head of the Cunard Line, a man by the name of Sir Percy Bates. And Felix said that Bates told him in confidence the true story about how the Queen Mary got its name. But Felix said that Bates would only tell him if he swore that he would not talk about the story until after he died. Now, Bates would pass away in the year 1946, which is probably why the story came out in the Lives of Liners in 1947. But anyway, Bates basically confirmed that this story did happen. This is how the Queen Mary got its name, and this is where the legend came from. So when I heard that, I was like, wow. That, I mean, honestly, what more proof do you need than, having the head of the Cunard Line tell you something? So, I mean, yeah. Now, believe it or not, guys, there is more evidence to back up what Felix said he heard Bates say during the Queen Mary's maiden voyage. We don't just have to take his word for it. You see, in 1988, Bernard, the author of that book, The Lives of Liners, he went to a dinner party. And while he was there, he met a woman named Eleanor Sparks, who was the daughter of a woman named Ashley Sparks, who was with Bates during the Queen Mary's maiden voyage. And you see, she said that her mom was sitting at that table when Bates told that story to Felix. And she basically confirmed that, yeah, that's what he said. That's how the Queen Mary got its name. So there you have it. You've got the source of the story, you know who heard it and where the testimony came from, and you've got two separate people at drastically different times that said that, yeah, he said that. Bates, the head of the Cunard Line, said that that's how the Queen Mary got its name. So honestly, guys, with that testimony, I'm convinced. I honestly believe that that's how the Queen Mary got its name. Now, again, we can't say with 100% certainty that that's what happened because officially Cunard Line still denies it. But I think it did happen. And ultimately, guys, what do you all think? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Okay, so now that all of you now know the full story on how the Queen Mary got its name, let's now jump back to the actual ship. By this time, the vessel's hull is completed and she is finally ready to be launched and enter the water for the very first time. However, before this could happen, there was a problem that the Cunard Line had to deal with. You see, the River Clyde, the water that the Queen Mary would be launched into, well, you see, the Queen Mary was so long and so heavy at this point that there was a risk that right after the Queen Mary was launched, she would simply go right across the river and ground herself on the other side. So to prevent this, the Cunard Line actually had to widen the river a bit, and they actually had to make the river a little bit deeper. Once this work was completed, the Queen Mary was finally launched on September 26, 1934. A ton of people came to watch the vessel be launched, and King George V and his wife, Mary of Trek, was also there as well. Queen Mary herself announced the vessel's name, and then once she said it, the vessel was finally slid down the slipway and she entered the water for the very first time. The launch went without any problems, and everyone that was there could not believe their eyes as they watched the Queen Mary slide down the slipway and enter the water for the very first time. However, at this point, the Queen Mary was still basically an empty shell. She still needed to go in for her fitting out process to be fitted with her engines and her furnishings and, everything that she would need to be turned into the ocean liner that she was always meant to become. All right, guys, well, with that, we have officially reached the end of part 1 of the Queen Mary series. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please be sure you tune in to part 2 as we continue the Queen Mary's story. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like. And if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot. And guys, make sure you also go and subscribe to Space Killer 555 and his friend Not Your Voice's YouTube channel. Link for them in the description below because they are the ones who created the incredible Queen Mary animation that you saw in this video. And the Lego Queen Mary that you saw right here, this was actually done by a company called Histobrick. They make incredible Lego products of famous ocean liners. I will also include a link to their website in the description as well. Be sure you go and check them out. This video series would not have been possible without them. Thank you guys so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.
Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.